Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
My parents told me I was on my own for school, and I believed them because they said it with the kind of final tone that makes you realize the decision was already made long before you were even included in the conversation. And it was followed by all the usual lines about responsibility and growing up and how life was going to be hard, so I might as well get used to it, as if cutting me off financially was some kind of life lesson instead of what it really was, which was just them washing their hands of me. I was barely 17 when I got that talk, sitting at the kitchen table while they explained in calm voices that college was going to be my problem and that I needed to figure out loans, scholarships, and jobs on my own, because they just didn't have the money. At that age, I didn't even have a full understanding of how financial aid worked, so all I could hear in that moment was that my future was entirely on me and there wasn't going to be a safety net waiting to catch me if I stumbled. So I worked, and I worked hard, balancing two part-time jobs while dragging myself through classes, filling out endless forms, begging for small scholarships, and signing loan papers that terrified me because the numbers felt bigger than anything I could imagine. I would call home sometimes, mostly out of habit, and I would hear updates about how things are tight and how every dollar counts, so I would bite my tongue and keep the resentment buried, telling myself they really must be struggling and I couldn't expect more. What made it harder was watching how differently my stepmom's daughter, Emily, lived. She was only a year younger than me, but she always seemed to have everything handled for her. New car, new clothes, summer trips, little luxuries that I would never dream of asking for. At first, I convinced myself maybe her mom was footing the bill separately, that maybe it wasn't fair to compare. But the truth started showing itself in pieces, little slips in conversations where my dad would casually mention how they helped Emily out with rent, or how they took care of her textbooks, while I was selling blood plasma just to keep my grocery money alive. Every time I heard something like that, it felt like another crack in whatever trust one had left, and I started replaying that original talk at the kitchen table in my head, over and over, asking myself if I had just misheard them. If maybe I had misunderstood. But I hadn't misunderstood at all. They were very clear about who was on their own, and it was me. The funny thing is, you'd expect that kind of treatment to make you hate them outright, but at the time it didn't. It made me double down, like I had something to prove, like maybe if I just worked hard enough and showed them what I could do without their help, they'd eventually see me differently and maybe even regret not being there. I carried that chip on my shoulder everywhere, dragging myself through exhaustion, eating dollar store noodles, pulling all-nighters because I couldn't cut back on work hours without falling behind on bills. And while I was killing myself just to keep up, they were gushing over Emily's achievements as if she had climbed Everest every time she passed a class or got an internship her mother arranged through a family friend. It was humiliating, but I didn't let them see me break. Instead, I built this wall around myself, telling them less and less, until eventually I stopped sharing anything real. They would ask about my classes, and I'd give short, vague answers, because what was the point of telling them I was barely making rent when all it would do was remind me that they had chosen to leave me drowning? I thought that was as bad as it would get, just this uneven playing field where I was scraping by and she was cruising, and I tried to swallow the bitterness, because what else could I do? But then came the moment that turned it all from unfair to unbearable, the moment that finally forced me to see the truth for what it really was. One evening, my stepmom called me with this cheerful voice, the kind of upbeat tone people use when they're about to brag and expect you to be happy for them, and she told me that Emily had just moved into her new house and that I should come by for the housewarming. I remember blinking at the phone, confused, because Emily was barely 20 at the time, still finishing school, and I couldn't wrap my head around how she could possibly afford a house already. That was when my stepmom, almost casually, dropped the detail that left me speechless. My parents had bought it for her. Not helped with the down payment, not co-signed the loan, they had literally bought her an entire house. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I hung up the phone, sat in silence, and realized that everything I had believed about us being tight on money had been nothing more than a carefully packaged lie designed to keep me on the outside. And the worst part wasn't even the money itself, it was the realization that they had never intended to invest in me, that I had been on my own not because they couldn't afford to help, but because they chose not to. At the time, I thought maybe I was just unlucky, maybe the universe had stacked the deck against me. But looking back, I can tell you with absolute certainty that luck had nothing to do with it. This was about choices, their choices, and the fallout of those choices was going to shape the rest of my life in ways they couldn't even imagine. And the truth is, that was only the beginning, because what came next made that first betrayal look almost small by comparison. When I finally agreed to go to Emily's housewarming, I told myself it was better to see it with my own eyes than to keep imagining what the place looked like, because part of me still thought maybe my stepmom had exaggerated. Maybe it wasn't as over the top as she had made it sound, and maybe, just maybe, my parents had only helped with some part of the cost rather than covering it all. I drove up feeling this knot in my stomach, the kind of mix between dread and curiosity that keeps you from turning the car around even when you want to, and when I pulled into the driveway and saw the house, a freshly painted two-story with a manicured lawn. It was like someone had physically shoved me backward, because I knew instantly that this was not some tiny starter home with peeling paint and cramped rooms. This was a full house, the kind you only got when someone handed you the keys, with a smile and told you not to worry about the details. I walked in and was hit immediately by the sound of laughter and the smell of catered food, the kind I could never afford in my college years, and all around me were people congratulating Emily on her accomplishment, as if she had somehow saved for this or earned it through years of sacrifice, when in reality the accomplishment was nothing more than being the chosen daughter. My dad saw me and came over with his proud grin, the same one he used when he used to cheer at my high school games, and he clapped me on the shoulder and told me, almost as if he was doing me a favor by sharing a family secret, that yes, they had bought the house outright, no mortgage, no strings attached, because they wanted Emily to have a good start in life. And I stood there, staring at him, trying to process how he could say those words without even flinching, without any awareness that he was speaking directly to the daughter who had been told she was on her own, who had signed her name on thousands of dollars of loans and bled herself dry just to keep a roof over her head. I don't remember much of the small talk after that because it all blurred together in this haze of disbelief, but I do remember Emily smiling and thanking everyone for coming, acting as if she had just been handed some award for hard work rather than a free pass to adulthood, and I remember my stepmom bragging about how generous they had been, making sure everyone in the room knew just how much my father had contributed to his stepdaughter's future. I held my drink so tightly I thought the glass would break in my hand, and all I could think was that this wasn't just unfair anymore. This was betrayal at a level that took the air out of the room. When I left that night, I didn't even say goodbye properly. I walked out quietly, got into my car, and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel for a long time, realizing that the last piece of me that had been making excuses for them, the part that still believed maybe they really couldn't afford to help me, had finally shattered. It wasn't about money. It was about choice. They had chosen her, time and time again, and this house was just the most undeniable proof of it. Over the next weeks, the phone calls started. The ones where my dad would ask why I was being distant, why I hadn't come around more, why I wasn't happy for the family. As if I should be celebrating the fact that my hard work and sacrifice had been treated as irrelevant while Emily was handed the kind of security I had begged for. I gave polite answers at first, vague excuses about being busy, but underneath I was boiling, because every time they tried to guilt me into being more present, I wanted to scream back that they had made their choice and now they had to live with the consequences. The thing is, you don't break all at once. You hit a point where you realize you can't go back, but you still go through the motions, trying to pretend maybe it's not as bad as it feels, maybe you can patch it together, maybe you can swallow it just a little longer. That was me during those months. I kept showing up occasionally, forcing small smiles, but each visit left me emptier, because every corner of that house reminded me of what had been taken from me, not the money, but the belief that I mattered equally. And then, one afternoon, after yet another phone call where my dad tried to pressure me into coming over for dinner, he said something that finally snapped the last thread holding me together. He said, "You know, family isn't about keeping score, it's about being there for each other." I almost laughed out loud because in that moment I realized that was exactly what they had been doing all along, keeping score, but only when it suited them, only when it justified putting Emily ahead of me. That was the day I stopped picking up their calls. That was the day I decided that if they wanted to treat me like I was disposable, then I was going to show them what it looked like when I acted accordingly. Because the truth was clear now. I had never been their priority, but I was about to become their biggest regret. After I cut off their calls, life started to feel strangely quieter, almost like a weight I didn't know I had been carrying had finally been set down, and while the silence from my parents wasn't immediate because they still tried to reach out through texts, emails, and the occasional message passed through a relative, I slowly began to understand that I didn't owe them my presence, my energy, or even my explanations anymore, because they had already shown me exactly where I stood in their version of a family hierarchy, and I wasn't about to keep begging for scraps of their approval when all they had ever done was hand the whole meal to someone else. At first, I thought the distance might make me feel guilty, that maybe I would lie awake at night wondering if I had been too harsh, but instead, I found myself sleeping better, eating better, and finally putting the hours I had once spent rehearsing conversations with them into building the kind of future they assumed I would never be able to create without their involvement. Work became the place where I poured all of that energy, and instead of dragging myself through every day with the exhaustion of someone who had been split between obligations and resentment, I started climbing in ways that shocked even me. I took on extra projects, I said yes to opportunities that scared me, and I pushed myself further because I realized no one was coming to save me, but that also meant no one could take the credit when I succeeded. The small wins began to add up, a promotion here, a raise there, and slowly, the kind of life I used to dream about when I was eating instant noodles at a wobbly secondhand table started to come within reach. Of course, my parents didn't stop trying to wedge their way back in. Holidays became the battlegrounds where they would either send guilt-laced invitations or have relatives corner me with lectures about forgiveness and not holding grudges, as if I was the one who had tipped the scales in Emily's favor. As if I had chosen to hand her a house while leaving myself drowning in loans. The irony was almost laughable, because while they painted me as the cold, distant one, they never once stopped to acknowledge that every step of distance had been carved out by their own decisions. I stayed polite in public, because it wasn't worth the drama of dragging out every ugly detail at a family gathering, but privately I kept my mouth shut and let them wonder why their words weren't pulling me back the way they expected. And in those moments of silence, something inside me shifted. I realized that revenge didn't always have to be loud or messy. Sometimes, the sweetest kind of payback was simply refusing to play the role they had written for me. They wanted me to be the struggling daughter, the one who limped back eventually, grateful for any scraps of attention or leftover support, but instead, I was building a version of myself they hadn't accounted for: strong, independent, and financially untouchable. Every time I saw Emily post pictures of her new chapter in that house, all decorated and cozy, I didn't feel envy anymore, because I knew the truth she probably didn't even realize: that house was her anchor, her reminder that she had never done it alone, while my freedom, every dollar and every success, was entirely mine. Still, the distance couldn't go unnoticed forever. My parents began shifting their tactics from guilt to flattery, suddenly remembering to call me driven and independent, phrases they had never once used during the years when I was working double shifts and collapsing into bed with overdue bills spread out on the nightstand. It was almost amusing, in a dark way, to hear them try to rewrite history, acting as if they had always admired my strength when I knew perfectly well they had left me no choice but to develop it. And yet, beneath their sudden praise, there was always this edge, this not-so-subtle hint that now that I was doing well, maybe it was time for me to step up and be part of the family again. A phrase that always came with the unspoken assumption that I would eventually take care of them. That was when the real idea started to take root. At first, it was just a passing thought, a flash of defiance that made me smirk in the middle of the workday. But the more I turned it over in my head, the clearer it became. If they wanted me to play the role of the dutiful daughter now that I had made it, then I was going to let them believe that for just long enough to set them up for the kind of disappointment they would never forget. I didn't need to slam the door in their faces outright, because that would only fuel their narrative of me as bitter and unforgiving. Instead, I was going to let them talk, let them hope, let them plan for a future where my success meant their comfort. And then I was going to show them that the only people who would ever benefit from what I built were the ones who had actually earned a place in my life. And so, while they thought I was still just distant and maybe a little stubborn, what I was really doing was laying the groundwork for a plan that would leave them stunned, because the truth was, I hadn't just stepped away from them. I had started preparing to make sure they would never again mistake my silence for weakness. And when the time came, they would understand that what they thought was indifference had been something far more deliberate all along. By the time a few years had passed, I had already transformed my life into something entirely different from what they had quietly predicted for me, because instead of crumbling under the weight of student loans, dead-end jobs, and constant exhaustion, I had built a career that not only supported me but gave me the kind of stability they once claimed they could never provide, and with each promotion, each project completed, and each financial milestone I hit, I felt a growing sense of satisfaction knowing that none of it had been tied to them, not even slightly. While Emily was still coasting through her comfortable setup in the house they had handed her, I was steadily stacking my achievements into something that belonged to me alone, and that contrast, though I rarely said it out loud, was the very fuel that kept me going on nights when the stress felt unbearable. It was during this period that my parents began to shift their tone in ways that would have been laughable if they hadn't been so insulting, because suddenly they were presenting themselves as proud parents, weaving my accomplishments into conversations with relatives as if they had somehow been the silent cheerleaders behind it all, and I would hear secondhand about how my father boasted at family gatherings that his daughter had become so successful, leaving out, of course, the small detail, that he had refused to help me with a single dollar when it mattered most. And while I might have been tempted once to correct the record, by then I understood the power of silence, because letting them bask in their own rewritten history only made it easier for me to see just how far I had outgrown them. The turning point came when the hints about the future became less subtle, and I began receiving comments about how, now that I was doing so well, it would be nice if I thought about helping out with family expenses, or maybe stepping in when things got tight for them, or eventually making sure they were comfortable in retirement, and those remarks always came coated with that familiar sense of expectation, as if it were a natural debt I was supposed to pay. I would smile, nod, and give vague non-answers, because while they thought I was being polite and hesitant, what I was really doing was watching them dig themselves deeper into the fantasy that my success would eventually be theirs to enjoy. The revenge itself wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was precise, and it began with something as simple as redirecting the story of my life toward the people who had actually been there for me. When I bought my first home, I didn't invite my parents to the closing or to the small gathering I had afterward, but I did invite the friends who had helped me through late nights of studying, the mentors who had given me advice when I was lost, and the colleagues who had lifted me up when I doubted myself. Every picture I posted, every update I shared, was a reminder that I was choosing who counted as family, and they were not part of that circle anymore. But the true moment came later, when I had reached a level of success that gave me freedom, not just comfort. They had grown bolder by then, assuming that it was only a matter of time before I extended my hand back to them, and my father even went so far as to suggest, during one strained phone call, that I should think about buying a larger home for the whole family to enjoy. I remember the pause I let hang in the air before I responded, because in that silence I realized this was the perfect moment to draw the line once and for all. I told him, in a calm voice, that I had already made my decision about who would share in my success, and that they were not on the list. There was no anger in my tone, no shouting, just the kind of clarity that slices through all the excuses and pretenses, and the silence on the other end of the line told me he understood exactly what I meant. That was my revenge, not a dramatic outburst or some messy confrontation, but the deliberate closing of a door they had assumed would always be open. They had chosen Emily over me, time and time again, and so I had chosen to build a future where they could look through the window if they wanted, but they would never step inside. The brilliance of it was in its simplicity. I didn't cut them off in a way they could frame as cruelty. I simply redirected everything I had to people who had truly earned it, and I let my parents sit with the realization that they had written themselves out of the ending of my story. The look on their faces the next holiday, when they tried once more to pretend nothing had changed and I politely but firmly declined their invitations, was priceless in its own quiet way, because for the first time, I saw them register that I wasn't bluffing. And in that moment, I knew I had won, not by sinking to their level or begging them to understand, but by creating a life so full, so completely mine, that their absence no longer mattered and their expectations had become nothing more than dust in the wind. In the months after I finally drew the line and made it clear that my success was mine alone and that their past choices had permanently shut them out of benefiting from what I had built, I started to notice the ripple effects of that decision spreading through the family like quiet shockwaves, because while my parents tried to maintain appearances and act as though nothing had really changed, the truth slipped out in subtle ways, and I could tell that the story they had told themselves about eventually reaping the rewards of my work had collapsed completely. Relatives began to reach out with carefully phrased questions, asking if it was true that I hadn't been around lately or if there had been some sort of misunderstanding, but behind their words I could hear the gossip already spinning. And it didn't take much to realize that my parents were painting me as the distant, ungrateful daughter who had simply abandoned them. What they failed to consider was that lies eventually meet reality, and reality always wins, because while they were complaining about my absence, those same relatives could see with their own eyes how I was living, how I was thriving, and how I was surrounding myself with people who valued me rather than diminishing me. They saw that the daughter who had supposedly been on her own had risen higher than anyone had predicted, and although my parents tried to twist that into another story about my independence being proof of their tough love, the cracks in their narrative were too obvious for anyone who had been paying attention all along. The whispers about Emily's house began surfacing too, not from me, but from people who had put the pieces together, because once you start asking questions about fairness, it doesn't take much to notice that one daughter was handed the world while the other was told to survive alone. For me, the aftermath wasn't about shouting my side of the story to every ear willing to listen, because I didn't need the validation of others to know I had been wronged. Instead, it was about maintaining the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish and refusing to let guilt pull me back into a cycle I had already escaped. That meant turning down invitations no matter how they were worded, ignoring calls that came laced with false cheer, and continuing to show up fully for the life I was building. There were moments when I caught myself wondering if I was being too harsh, if maybe I should at least allow a surface-level connection just to keep the peace. But every time I remembered the night of that housewarming party and the smug certainty on their faces when they revealed what they had done for Emily, the doubt evaporated. Because I understood that going back would only mean agreeing to play a role where my needs were always second, and I was long past living in that shadow. The most telling moment came during one particular holiday season when my father called and, with a tone that was equal parts weary and entitled, asked why I never visited anymore. He said it as if he genuinely couldn't fathom the reason, as though the decades of choices they had made had somehow slipped his memory, and I realized then that for people like them, it wasn't about forgetting. It was about refusing to acknowledge anything that made them look less than generous. I answered him honestly, though, without raising my voice or sugarcoating it. I told him that the reason I never visited was simple, because when I was young and needed them most, they told me I was on my own, and then they turned around and gave everything I had begged for to someone else. There was no apology on his end, no sudden moment of clarity, only silence and then a hurried change of subject, but I knew in that pause that my words had landed exactly where they were supposed to. From that point forward, I stopped entertaining the possibility of reconciliation, not out of spite, but out of clarity. My parents had built their future around the assumption that I would eventually fold, that I would forget the past and slide back into the role of the dutiful daughter once I was successful enough to make their lives easier. And my refusal to do so was the sharpest form of revenge I could have delivered. They could complain, they could spin stories, they could paint me as cold, but deep down they knew the truth. They had chosen their side a long time ago, and now they were living with the consequences of that choice. Emily, for her part, never reached out to bridge the gap, and I never expected her to, because she had benefited too much from the arrangement to ever see the unfairness of it. In some ways, that was the final piece of closure I needed, because it reminded me that my fight was never with her, but with the people who were supposed to protect me and instead decided to invest their love and resources elsewhere. Watching her live in that house, comfortably but unremarkably, while I carved out a life of my own making, was the most fitting contrast I could have asked for. And so, when people ask why I never visit, why I no longer show up at gatherings or sit at their table pretending that we are one big happy family, I tell them the truth without hesitation, because I built my life alone, without their help, without their faith, and without their support, and I will not pretend otherwise just to ease their guilt. They gave away the house, they gave away their loyalty, and in doing so, they gave away me. What remains now is not bitterness, but resolve, the kind that ensures they will never again mistake my silence for weakness, and they will never again assume that their choices come without consequences. I won, not because I destroyed them, but because I freed myself, and that is a victory they can never take back.